Hello everyone, thank you for joining me for another devlog on the shooter game I'm developing with Unreal Engine 5.
This week, I focused on addressing movement issues while aiming with the rifle, implementing the rifle's reload animation, and beginning enemy setup. Before we delve into this week's progress, let's briefly recap the previous devlog. I discussed the inventory system and introduced a new character along with a new weapon type, the rifle. I had a complete set of rifle animations, except for the reload animation and the animations related to the character's rotation, which brings us to this week. For the rifle reload animation, I wanted to see the character actually removing and reattaching the magazine clip during the reload, creating the illusion of replacing it with a new one. Let me give you a high-level overview of this. When the character's left hand touches the rifle, the animation sends a notifying event. This detaches the magazine and attaches it to the character's hand, so the magazine moves with the hand. Once the left hand touches the rifle again, the animation sends another notifying event to reattach the magazine to the rifle. After addressing the reload animation, I worked on adding aim offsets when aiming. Aim offsets is used to make the character look in the direction the camera is facing. This was implemented only for when the player is not aiming. Fortunately, the process was simple, so it didn't take much time to implement. At that point, I noticed that the strafing animations didn't work too well when we're aiming, so I disabled the aiming animation when the character is in motion. Overall, this adjustment didn't significantly impact the game's feel, as aiming animations are more important when the character is stable. Players can still aim while moving, well, to some extent, as the screen still zooms in. Before moving on to creating enemies, I discovered that we can customize the color theme in Unreal Engine. Now, for my text editors and IDs, I prefer a color scheme called Groovebox. It has a nice retro theme, keeps the colors easily distinguishable while maintaining a pleasant look for the eyes. The problem is, I couldn't find it for Unreal Engine, so I created it myself to the best of my ability. I have uploaded to my GitHub page along with instructions to set it up if you would like to use a theme yourself. Look at how the editor looks now. Perfect. After spending some time admiring the beauty of my new color scheme, I started working on the enemy. I faced a tough decision here because so far in the development process, I've set up the weapons without paying much attention to how an enemy might use it. However, now I've decided that I want enemies who also shoot at you in addition to melee enemies. After all, this is a shooter game. I initially tried to come up with an inheritance-based solution where both the player and enemy would inherit from a base shooter class. However, I realized that the enemy and the player doesn't share too much functionality other than shooting. After searching through the internet trying to figure out which approach would fit best in the scenario, I decided to implement the enemy class separately and use interfaces where there is shared functionality. This beautiful video from Code Aesthetics surely influenced my decision. At this point, I started to think more and more about the kind of game I want to make. Before starting out on making the enemy, I thought about whether I want to make the combat more adrenaline-filled and fast-paced like Doom, or one that requires more tact like the combat in the Last of Us series. On one hand, a fast-paced combat style might be easier to implement because I assume that will require less work on setting up the enemy area. On the other hand, I personally enjoy a combat that requires a bit more stealth, which means that I'll have better insight into how I can make it more enjoyable. I'm leaning more towards implementing at least some stealth, but I'll leave the door open for further changes and see where the game goes. After creating the enemy class, I've added some mesh to it and attached an AI controller. I made the enemy follow me just to see AI controller working properly. Now that I had an enemy to shoot at, it was time to revisit the shooting mechanics. Until now, all shooting meant was to spawn impact particles at the point of the hit. But now, we check if the actor we hit can actually register the hit. And if so, we spawn particles specific to the actor. I also added health to the enemy, which decreases with every shot, and I added extra damage on headshots. This was relatively simple thanks to Unreal. It makes it easy to get the name of the bone that the player hits, so we can check if that bone is the head, and if so, we can register extra damage. That's all for this video. I hope to see you next week, hopefully with some exciting updates on the enemy. Bye.